Alice Munro is arguably my favorite living author. Her stories are my favorite kinds of stories. The ones where nothing really happens. The ones that, at their best, present ordinary life in a way that doesn't answer questions or offer lessons, but forces you to put yourself in the shoes of the characters. They're the types of stories that make you feel closer to humanity because they're so specific yet so universal. There are too many stories of hers that I absolutely love, but I'd like to talk for a bit about one called Cortes Island. To get all the superficial stuff out of the way, the story takes place in post-World War II Vancouver. We follow the unnamed narrator, a woman in her early 20s who moves into a basement apartment with her new husband, Chess. The main unit in the apartment is occupied by the landlord's parents, Mr. Gorey, who is paralyzed and nonverbal after suffering a stroke, and Mrs. Gorey, who is, to be blunt, a textbook narcissist. From the very beginning, we learn that no one gives Mrs. Gorey the time of day. Her son Ray, the landlord, answers her in monosyllables, and we learn that she knows almost nothing about his life, and that what she does know she criticizes relentlessly. Chess instinctually identifies Mrs. Gorey as not someone to mess with, and adopts a similar strategy as Ray whenever she corners him and tries to talk to him. The narrator also tries to ignore and avoid Mrs. Gorey, but she's young, inexperienced, and unemployed, so she's home a lot of the days, and eventually avoiding Mrs. Gorey becomes impossible. In almost every conversation, Mrs. Gorey finds something to criticize the narrator for, from her housekeeping to her habits to the way she dresses. It's incredibly cruel, but it's always veiled in mock concern or passive aggressiveness. It's worth noting that Mrs. Gorey does not dare act this way with Ray or with Chess, but seems to have no qualms with ridiculing the narrator to her face. Eventually, the narrator decides she needs to get a job, and Mrs. Gorey pressures her into watching Mr. Gorey in the afternoons, claiming that she started volunteering at a hospital and needed someone to watch him while she's at work. Shortly after the narrator takes the job, Chess reveals that one afternoon he saw Mrs. Gorey getting off a bus on the opposite side of town as the hospital she was supposedly working at. During one of their afternoons together, Mr. Gorey gestures for the narrator to look at a newspaper clipping he had saved in a scrapbook as a young man. The article describes a fire on Cortes Island, not far from Vancouver, where a house burned down with a man inside. The newspaper further reveals that the dead man's wife had not been home, but had been on a boat with one James Thompson Gorey. The article goes on to say that the couple's son had been instructed by the husband to go into town right before the fire, and that the boy was later found lost but unharmed. The implication of the article is that Mr. and Mrs. Gorey were having an affair, and Mrs. Gorey's first husband found out and burned their house down with himself inside, and that Ray is the child that the article mentions. But we don't get any kind of confirmation. Only a cryptic look for Mr. Gorey that the narrator takes to mean, did you ever think that people's lives could be like that and end up like this? Well, they can. Not long after, the narrator gets a full-time job at a library, and consequently can't look after Mr. Gorey anymore, which enrages Mrs. Gorey to the point that she is openly antagonistic towards the narrator, dropping all pretense of friendliness or mock concern. Chess, not fully comprehending the situation, tries to comfort the narrator in probably the most unhelpful way imaginable by telling her that Mrs. Gorey resents her because she is young and pretty while Mrs. Gorey is old and grotesque. Eventually, in no small part because of the incessant harassment, the two find a new, nicer apartment and move, which only makes Mrs. Gorey even angrier. Despite all that unpleasantness, once the narrator and her husband move, the Goreys become a distant memory, and the young couple begins to settle into real adulthood. The only thing that lingers for the narrator from the experience is the image of Mr. Gorey, and for years afterwards she has recurring erotic dreams with what she imagined him to be as a young man. As her conscious life with her husband becomes more and more respectable and proper, her unconscious life with Mr. Gorey remains ugly and profane, and she gets in the habit of waking up with, quote, a memory I got used to denying in the morning. The story ends with an image of Cortes Island as the narrator imagines it, not with the charred remains of the man from the newspaper, but with the green forest that's grown up around it. A large theme of the story is that of fate and inevitability. The narrator and her husband are just starting in life, and both of them feel immense pressure to live in the mold of the generations that preceded them. We see this most clearly from the narrator's perspective in the bitchy little jabs Mrs. Gorey throws at her. She criticizes the narrator largely on domestic grounds, on the ways that wives should support their husbands and run their households. We don't see the other side of this marital obligation as much, but it's alluded to throughout. Chess is said to work long hours at a job he has no passion for, after giving up his dream of becoming a history teacher on his father's advice that, quote, teaching was no way to support a wife and get on in the world. The narrator is surprised by how easily Chess gives up his dreams for the sake of a comfortable life, but rationalizes it by telling herself that it's, quote, simply what men do. The story takes place in the 1950s, and a current of sexual and social repression undergirds the character's actions. The narrator describes the circumstances of her marriage as the, quote, bargain, struck so that she and Chess would be able to have sex without judgment, with the narrator opining that it seems to her that sexual expression is the obvious reason for marriage, not things like houses and babies. Throughout the story, there is an invisible push and pull regarding living a typical middle-class existence. The narrator seems repulsed by it, but is unable to give voice to that repulsion. It manifests occasionally in her reticence to find a job and her lack of enthusiasm towards housework, but as soon as she gets a real job in a library, she gains confidence, and with that confidence she gravitates towards the same banal middle-class existence that originally repulsed her, giving up her own passions in the pursuit of, quote, respectability, even as her more, quote, pagan instincts carry on below the surface in her dreams with Mr. Gorey. The potential and freedom of youth gives way to the routine and structure of adulthood, and because she's repressed, the narrator is unable to consciously recognize what she lost in that transition. Deeply intertwined with this desire for respectability is a preoccupation shared by every character in the story with how they're perceived by others. As we've already discussed, the narrator and her husband are young and feel that they have to prove themselves to be capable and self-reliant, but those insecurities are mirrored in the Goreys, who are not young. There are a number of small details throughout the story that shows the cracks in the facade Mrs. Gorey presents in the world. Ray is said to be interested in a woman named Irene who has cerebral palsy, and Mrs. Gorey gossips behind his back about how repulsive people must find them. She then hurriedly contends that people don't think that way about her and Mr. Gorey. The narrator pays her rent directly to Mrs. Gorey rather than to Ray, and implies that Mrs. Gorey takes some or all of the money for herself to pay for her expenses, since they're otherwise living off Mr. Gorey's small pension. Despite this, when Mrs. Gorey lies about getting a job so the narrator will watch Mr. Gorey, for a measly 40 cents an hour, she has to make it clear that she's volunteering and doesn't need the money a job would offer her. And despite this claim, there are more details that betray the Goreys as poverty, from the rundown furniture in their apartment to the detail that Mrs. Gorey makes her own clothes. Although the focus of the story is less on him, there are flashes of Mr. Gorey's insecurities as well. The narrator takes great pains to describe Mr. Gorey as someone who looks as if they were once commanding and strong, but in his current state he's totally subservient and helpless. The narrator learns in the process of watching him that he hates to be wheeled out in public, and it's implied through his limited communication that he deeply resents Mrs. Gorey and the airs she puts on. Once, before she's offered the job watching Mr. Gorey, the narrator runs into the Goreys on the street. Mrs. Gorey is dressed in a flamboyant cape and beret, while Mr. Gorey is in a low cap and thick scarf that hides his body. While Mrs. Gorey waves and says hello, Mr. Gorey looks down and pretends not to see the narrator. When Mrs. Gorey first introduces herself to the narrator and her husband, she gives them some homemade cookies that the narrator describes as dry and hard with a bright pink icing. In that description alone, we glean almost everything there is to say about Mrs. Gorey as a character. Cortes Island and Alice Munro's writing in general is absolutely stuffed with little details like this that give insight into the characters and their motivations without being gratuitous or caricatured. She doesn't pick things apart and explain them in excruciating detail. She leaves small breadcrumbs in the story and trusts the reader's intelligence to pick things out and draw their own conclusions. In a media landscape increasingly dominated by mass-produced narratives that have the subtlety of a sledgehammer, stories like Cortes Island are reminders of what an author can achieve when they treat their audience with respect and refuse to pander to the lowest common denominator.